Number 1. Tent. I've lived in the same house for quite a long time. I've rented it for over 10 years, and in that time, I've had a lot of neighbors move in and out. I got along with some of them really great, and even the ones that I have never really talked to very much, I never had any problems with. But about 2 years ago, a new neighbor moved into the house next door. I've never been really sure who lives there, however. There always seems to be different people hanging out on the front porch. There are always different cars there as well. I think I've recognized a few of the people as being there more often, and I figured out that they are the ones who actually live in the house. But still, I didn't know them at all. It was only a guess. There are some weird things that have happened, but nothing I really thought too much about. After a while, though, I noticed that someone had set up a tent in their backyard. It took a while, but I finally began seeing the same person coming in and out of the tent all the time. When it had been there for a few weeks, that is when I started thinking that the person living in the tent had moved in as well. Still, that might have been the sort of thing that might have bothered other people, but it didn't bother me in any way. I lived in a tent in the back of more than 1 yard in my day. But one day, recently, when I was going into the kitchen for a drink, I noticed some movement in my backyard. Curious, I went and took a look, and saw this strange woman walking around in the backyard. But she wasn't only just walking, it looked like she was talking to herself too. Also, she would be pacing back and forth in the yard, occasionally spinning around in a circle while she was doing it. Other than being curious, I didn't think much else about it. She was in the further back part of the yard, and she seemed to be minding her own business. Plus, when she was done with her walking around, she retreated back to the tent. That was when I realized that there was more than one person living in that tent. That had been the first time I had seen the strange-acting woman, and it would not be the last time. Over the next week or so, I would see the woman wandering around in the backyard, doing the same thing. Yet she never caused any problems, so it wasn't a big deal to me. It didn't take very long until she was just another thing that I didn't pay any attention to. Then, the other night, I was in the living room reading a book. I got up to get me a glass of water, and while I was at the sink, I heard some weird noises. It only took me a moment before I realized that they were coming from the back door. I figured perhaps that an animal had gotten up on the porch, and that was not unusual. I walked into the laundry room, which had the back door that led to the porch behind the house. I flipped on the light switch for the porch, prepared to look out the window in the back door and see what kind of animal was out there. Looking down, without having opened the door, I saw that it wasn't an animal at all that was making the noises. Instead, there was a person who was crouched down on the porch. I couldn't tell who it was at first, because they were bent over. It seemed like they were doing something to the back door. At first, the light coming on didn't seem to affect the person at all. It seemed like I was staring down at them for a longer moment than I probably was. But then suddenly, they looked up, and my eyes met their eyes. It was the woman who was being strange in my backyard earlier in the week. The woman stood up really quickly, and we looked each other in the eyes for just a moment. I couldn't tell what sort of look was even behind those eyes, as the woman quickly took off down the porch and into the neighbor's yard, where I could no longer see her. I was a bit freaked out, and then I opened the door, really just to see where she might have run off to, but it was when I was out there that I noticed something a whole lot worse. There were all these weird symbols drawn on my back door. I couldn't tell what kind of symbols they were, but that wasn't what got me the most. What truly disturbed me was that it appeared that the symbols were drawn in blood. And not only that, but to confirm the idea it was blood, there were drops of it running down the porch. I was able to see what the lady had done before, being weird in the backyard, as nothing really important, but this was freaky. All I could do was run back into the house and call the police. The neighbors told the police that the woman was just someone who'd been spending some time over as a guest. She had some mental issues and would be leaving. I didn't have her arrested because I really just thought she was messed up. But as far as I'm aware, she stopped living in that tent since it was taken down. Number 2. Kurt. When I was 12 years old, I switched schools and my family moved. The place we went to was very different than I had been before. We didn't live in a rural area, really, but we did live in a place that was outside of town. My parents would normally give me rides to and from school at this new area, but they sometimes weren't able to. Whenever they couldn't, I didn't mind walking home. I would always take a shortcut through the woods in order to get there a lot faster. I had some problems fitting into school as the new kid. Most of the kids who were at that school grew up together. That made it difficult for me to make friends. Because of that, I spent a lot of time by myself, or making friends with the friendless. So because of that, I also became the object of a few bullies for the first time in my life. This took place on a really cool fall day. One of the things I remember most clearly is how the leaves were heavily falling off the trees. It was jacket-wearing weather, but not really cold if you understand. When my parents dropped me off in the morning, they let me know they wouldn't be able to pick me up on time due to work. So I let them know that I was just going to walk home. After school, it would start getting dark pretty early, even before I made it home. So I walked quickly as I could, not wanting to be out in the dark, because it was darker than it had ever been when I was walking home. So I almost regretted taking the shortcut through the woods. But the fear was just normal apprehension, and I didn't turn around or anything. Even though there was a bit of wind blowing through the trees that day, I could still hear what was going on around me pretty good. It didn't take long before I began hearing what sounded like footsteps. Looking around, I just expected to see someone else taking the same shortcut, or just enjoying a walk in the woods. But I didn't see anyone else out there but me. I didn't think anything of it, however. I don't think most people really begin worrying about hearing footsteps until those footsteps become something to actually worry about. As I was walking forward, though, suddenly, someone walked out from behind a tree right in front of me. He was so close to me that it caused me to fall back and down onto the ground. Fortunately, I wasn't hurt. However, I was scared to realize that this was Kurt, one of the kids at school who bullied me. Plus, he was holding a pocket knife in his right hand as he lurched over me. He also had this really evil smile on his face, a look that I will never forget years later. I quickly got up to my feet and did the only thing that I could think of to do. When I had fallen onto the ground, my hand had felt a rock. I had grabbed onto it before I got back up again. Not wasting a single second, I threw the rock right at Kurt's face, hitting him below the eye and staggering him. While he was holding his face and cursing, I ran past him as quickly as I could. That was my biggest advantage. I ran a lot, and I could run pretty fast. It didn't take me very long before I heard Kurt screaming behind me that he was going to kill me. He kept yelling, as he must have been chasing me, but I did my best job to not look back and see him. I just kept running and running. I figured Kurt was not nearly in the good shape that I was, as he was overweight, and he never participated much in gym class, so by the time I got out of the woods, I was no longer hearing his screams at me. That didn't matter, however. I still continued to run until I got to my house, in which I locked myself inside quickly. I kept the lights out and kept a lookout for Kurt until my parents got home. I told them what happened and they contacted the police. I guess Kurt's parents and the police had a good talk with him because, although he still gave me dirty looks whenever he saw me, he never tried something like that again. Number 3. Upstairs. When I was a little girl, about 7 or 8, my mother had some sort of financial troubles, and she, my sisters, and I found ourselves living with my Aunt Sally for a short while. Aunt Sally's house was unlike any I had seen at the time. It was a very old-fashioned house. I think it would be described as Victorian style now. It was a fairly large house with lots of rooms to explore and play in, and for the most part I enjoyed my time there. But there was one rule in the house that seemed strange. We were absolutely forbidden to go up to the second floor. No reason was ever given, and there was plenty of room downstairs. But there is nothing that gets a child more curious than telling them that they can't do something and not telling them why. So of course, as soon as the adults were otherwise occupied, I snuck upstairs to see what was so bad that we weren't supposed to see it. But what I found out just gave me more questions. The upstairs itself was fairly normal. There were a few rooms, bedrooms, an office, and a bathroom. But what had my attention was the locked door at the end of the hall. These were old doors with the big metal knobs and the actual keyhole for locking it with a key. And just like in the movies, I could peek through that keyhole. The room was fairly dark, but there was some light coming in from a window somewhere. The small area of the room I could see seemed to be a child's room. There was a small bookcase, a tiny rocking chair, and toys. Toys that were covered in dust, as they obviously hadn't been played with for some while. The tiny rocking chair had 3 or 4 plushies squeezed into it. A gray plush rabbit's dusty eye seemed to be judging me for peeking. There were toy trucks, a ball, and various other toys covered in dust and going unplayed with. Once I had seen the room, it dominated my thoughts. I was desperate to show someone, but I couldn't take my sisters. They were too little. June was still a baby. Of course, I couldn't discuss it with the adults, as they'd be mad at me for having gone upstairs. So I just kept it to myself, and pondered just what this discovery actually meant. Then one day our cousins visited. There was Sarah, who often played with me in spite of the fact she was much older than me at 12, and her 2 brothers, Josh and Rob, 14 and 15 or so, if I remember right. Josh was alright most of the time, but Rob was downright mean. He was always tormenting us girls, and sometimes he'd even get Josh to join in. I don't remember why, but for some reason, the adults left us there. The older kids were in charge, of course, but they didn't pay a lot of attention to anything. When the boys went off to do whatever it was they did, I told Sarah we had to go upstairs. She was hesitant at first. I explained to her what I saw, and she became curious. We began discussing the possibility that Aunt Sally had had a kid that passed away. None of us had ever heard of her having any kids, but maybe that was why? As we talked, I must have gotten loud in my excitement, forgetting to whisper as Rob piped in on our conversation. "Oh yeah, she used to have a little boy," he grinned. "He died a long time ago, and he still haunts the house. You better not go upstairs, or he'll catch you in the stairwell and kill you." Sarah very boldly told Rob to stuff it, and when he wandered off to do whatever he was doing with Josh, Sarah and I went to the door that led to the stairwell, as she was now very eager to see the room. The stairwell itself was enclosed. There was a door on both ends that looked very much like a closet, but when you opened the door there were stairs. It was a narrow tunnel, and the walls being so closed made me nervous. Years later I would realize This was the first sign of my claustrophobia, but nervous was the only way I could describe it then. We walked slowly up the stairs, freezing with every creak of the board. We listened intently to see if anyone had heard us. Part of me was afraid that it was not Josh and Rob who would hear us, but someone else. Something else. We reached the top of the stairs, and my nervousness gave way to excitement as the stale air hit me. We shut the stairway door, and I motioned for Sarah to follow me to the room. She had to kneel down to look through the keyhole. As she looked, she was silent. Then finally she turned from the keyhole and looked at me with shock. They did have a kid. They must have. Poor thing must have died, she said, and looked through the keyhole again before letting me have a look. I had seen it many times before, but I always wanted to see it again. I was standing there with my eye to the keyhole when I heard a creak from the stairwell. Sarah and I both looked towards the stairs to see Rob standing there, watching us from the now open door. I told you you shouldn't go upstairs. Now, he's gonna punish you, he said with an evil grin, before bolting back down the squeaky stairs. Sarah and I immediately ran to the stairs and rushed down them, leaving the upper door open in our haste. We tried the knob, but the door was locked. Sarah banged on it and demanded Rob let us out. I can't let you out. He's got to punish you. He's gonna kill you both, he shouted through the door, laughter in his voice. Both of us were pounding on the door, demanding to be let out, when I stopped and looked back up the stairwell, realizing we had left the door open. We'd have to go back up and shut it, or we'd get in trouble. But I suddenly didn't want to go up those stairs again. I wasn't excited by the mystery, I was terrified. Sarah stopped banging on the door and followed my gaze to the top of the stairs. We were staring at the open door, and when we suddenly heard running footsteps from the upper floor, Sarah turned back to the door and began banging again. Suddenly the upstairs door slammed shut with a bang, and I screamed. Part of me knew he was making it up, and that I shouldn't listen, but the fear was so strong and overwhelming. Who had been upstairs? Who had slammed the door? The stairway was pitch black now. Rob had turned out the light on his way down. Sarah and I ran into each other as we groped at the wall for the light switch. We were both screaming, but I didn't know what we said or even if it was words. I suddenly found myself unable to breathe. The darkness and the walls were closing in. My ears were ringing and my head was spinning when suddenly the door opened. Getting out into the open room was such a relief. Sarah punched Rob somewhere on his body, though I'm sure it didn't hurt him. Josh sat on the floor and pulled me into his lap, talking calmly to me. As I calmed down and began to breathe normally, I was suddenly embarrassed and scared by whatever had happened, and I began to cry. I wouldn't know until years later that my claustrophobia and the fear of the supposed ghost had caused me to have my first panic attack. To this day, I have no idea what was going on with that room, because I never bothered to ask. I never snuck up there again, and when I got together with my cousins, I'd always punch Rob when he brought it up. As adults, I mentioned it to him, but he doesn't even remember having done it. He doesn't at all remember how mean he was, and he's a much nicer person now. But the one thing that will always bother me about that day was that all of us, kids, were downstairs. Rob and Josh were right there when Sarah and I got out of the stairwell. So who had slammed the upper door? Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. First I want to thank all my paid Patreon subscribers, starting with my 2 VIPs, Chiamerah Cat and Pixie Hopper 8. I also want to thank Stinky News, EricaOdd, Tracy Sellars, Chronic J, and Heidi H. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I hope you're doing your best to stay out of the heat because it has been so hot. But just to let everyone know, I've been doing a pretty good job at keeping hydrated. It's been 2 weeks since I've been in the hospital, and I haven't had any sort of relapse into the state that I had been in before. In fact, I've been feeling pretty good for the most part. So if you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and the bell so you'll be notified of new videos. Leave me a comment, and as always, I will try to get back to every comment as quickly as I can, and share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you want narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please send it to the address included in the description. And now, I would like to mention my free Patreon members: Anthony Bowers, Remi, Venikins, Rose Metro, Woofer McWooferson, Cindy Cleveland, Vanapira Rayne, William H., Alien Unicorn 13, Kathryn Lynch, The Bama Guy 334, Michael Vasquez, Bonnie Lynn, Collet Bond, Krista Pike, Prince UVA, HF Creations, Bonnie Gibbs, Linda Moore, DJ Lira, and Evil Black Cat. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.